300-pound dudes tackling you on a frozen field, the last thing you want to do is stay out there. Believe me, the Rams players were thinking about the jacuzzi at their team hotel, that they find it laughable, but more laughable if they totally disregard the trade whatsoever. This guy has transformed the balance of power in the Eastern Conference. And you could argue the entire defense is going to be absolutely ferocious next year. But if your number one priority is to win a Super Bowl, then J.J. Watt is making a grave mistake. I have to ride this Chad Henne experiment for an entire game. I might need a whole bottle of Hennessy just to get through that. Guy who's won 8 division titles, who's made 5 AFC championship appearances, who's reached the Super Bowl 3 times and has won 2 Super Bowls for this organization. Aaron Rodgers has only won 1 Super Bowl with Green Bay. Drew Brees has only won 1 Super Bowl with New Orleans. There's only 13 quarterbacks in NFL history that have won multiple Super Bowls, and Big Ben is one of those individuals. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe right here on JJ Media Network, Facebook Live, Twitter, and on YouTube. I'm Jonah Malkin with you every single Monday and Wednesday morning, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 to 11 Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. Glad you could join me on this Wednesday morning. A lot to discuss, some new changes in overtime rules in the NFL. Even my guest from NBC Sports and a huge North Carolina Tar Heels fan, Ben Cross, is going to be joining me later on in the show. But I have to start with the NBA, and in particular, one of the more notable games that took place last night between the Milwaukee Bucks and the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, one of the reasons why recency bias is very real in sports is because we are blessed to be able to see so many of these athletes perform at their highest levels night in and night out. And I think the era in sports that we're in, we're starting to see this on a more consistent basis, on a more daily basis, where athletes, men, women, they are putting up historically great numbers, performances. And normally we get so enamored by these recent performances that we develop this recency bias. We believe that the last performance or moment that we saw was one of the most incredible moments, one of the greatest moments that we've seen from that sport. That's kind of how this recency bias develops. And that's one of the reasons why when we look at championships and why championships are so coveted is because of the respect that those athletes get. And in particular, the fact that you're beloved, the fact that you're celebrated, the fact that you're acknowledged and respected eternally for what you are accomplished and what you have accomplished, it has a lasting effect that can sometimes look past and jump over that recency bias that may exist. So typically, when you are an NBA champion, you are given the benefit of the doubt the following season across multiple categories. That's what we see. And yet somehow, despite the fact that last year when the Milwaukee Bucks won the NBA title and Giannis was named Finals MVP, we've forgotten about him this year. We've completely disregarded Giannis Antetokounmpo this year throughout MVP talks. This is a guy who is a 2-time league MVP, a defensive player of the year, and the reigning finals MVP, and we forgot about him. We simply haven't included him in the MVP discussion for the longest time. And for me, this is one of the problems that we've had with the NBA's regular season MVP is you have purists who sometimes try to hearken back to previous performances to justify voting for guys this year. And you've got other media experts out there who vote for players that are having the best particular season, which is what the award is about. But oftentimes, when a player's previous results and previous performances match the type of production that they're having the following season, you normally give that athlete more of a benefit of the doubt. We haven't been giving Giannis that benefit of the doubt all season. And yet, throughout this entire year, the leading candidate for league MVP has fluctuated. It's been kind of cyclical, very fluid. It's a constantly changing target. First couple months of the year, Steph and KD. Then it was Jokic. Then it was Embiid. Then it was DeMar DeRozan and John Moran and Devin Booker most recently getting into the fold. And yet Giannis has always kind of been hovering in this conversation, but we've never really given him the shine and the light that he's deserved for the type of season that he's been having, because somehow he's been overshadowed by other players. And last night was a great reminder of why it's impossible to jump to those types of conclusions earlier on in the season, and why when you have an athlete who's been so productive the previous seasons, and especially last year, and you're seeing the same production this year, how he's gone under the radar baffles me. Because last night, the Milwaukee Bucks outlasted the revamped 76ers on the road in Philadelphia, 118-116. Embiid, Harden, their team entirely intact. Tobias Harris, entirely healthy against the Milwaukee Bucks. Defending NBA champs, coming on the road. And they won by 2, and it was all decided by game-winning block by Giannis Antetokounmpo. Have we ever seen a Giannis block in a clutch spot before? Oh, yeah, Game 4 of the NBA Finals against the Phoenix Suns, where he literally switched out to help defend Devin Booker a step inside the arc, and then recovered in time to block an alley-oop pass from Booker to DeAndre Ayton at the rim. He covered about 15 feet of ground in a second and a half to deny Ayton the block, to deny Ayton the alley-oop, and to seal that game for victory. And so, obviously, he ended up sealing the NBA Finals with that 50-point performance, 5 blocks in that game as well. So right now, it's been pretty much I think it's come down to a 2-man race for league MVP. You've got Jokic and you've got Giannis. I think that last night essentially eliminated Joel Embiid. It's not like he didn't play well. He played well, 29 points, 14 rebounds, 7 assists, but you're playing alongside James Harden, which diminishes your chances. And who by the way, still dropped 32 points and 9 assists for you. So he played pretty well. The problem is the 76ers have had ample opportunities recently with Joel Embiid to make statements at home, and they haven't been able to do it. They lost to CP3 and Devin Booker and the Suns a couple days ago. They lost to Nikola Jokic at home. They lost to KD and Kyrie at home. Now they lost to Giannis and the Bucks at home. So I think that Joel Embiid is kind of out of it. And when you look at Jokic and when you look at him and Giannis, Jokic is obviously having a fantastic season. 26 points, 13.5 rebounds, 8 assists, 57.5% shooting from the floor. Best PER in the league. And he's only missed 7 games, and the Nuggets are 2-5 without him. He's obviously playing without Jamal Murray, and Michael Porter Jr. hasn't been a part of the team for long stretches. And I just received a notification that he's been experiencing further setbacks with his recovery. So you certainly have to give Jokic a ton of credit. On the flip side, Giannis is averaging a tick under 30 points, 11.5 rebounds, 6 assists, also over 55% shooting from the floor. And he's missed 11 games. His team is 5-6 without him. So both of those guys are extremely invaluable. They're extremely valuable, and they also are invaluable because you can't play without them for their respective teams. And you look at their records, and they're pretty similar. The Nuggets are 45-31, sixth in the Western Conference. The Bucks are 47-28, second in the East, just a half a game back of the Miami Heat for first. So, again, I'd say in the top five, if you want to group it to five, I'd have Jokic, Giannis, Embiid, and then probably Ja Morant and Devin Booker, although you could flip it. And Luka Doncic is right on the outskirts as well, making a compelling case. He's obviously having a sensational season, leading Dallas to the fourth spot all by his lonesome. I think Devin Booker, who's obviously come on strong as of late, is starting to send a message to the league. Hey, I've improved as a leader. I've grown as a leader. And the last stretch of basketball over the past month, without CP3, obviously he just came back. But prior to his return, we were starting to see the maturity and the growth and the development of Devin Booker and how he is starting to reshape his image and become a winning basketball player. But I think he came on too late for him to really knock off Jokic or Giannis. I just mentioned Embiid, I think, was knocked out of it last night. And Ja Morant, listen, I don't know how this narrative has started to swirl around the last couple of days that just because the Memphis Grizzlies are 18-2 without him, that all of a sudden Ja Morant shouldn't be an MVP candidate. I've been hearing all these conversations. I don't even know why these were topics discussed on a show. If anything, yes, you should highlight how good of a team Memphis is. But if anyone's trying to make the case that because the Memphis Grizzlies are winning games now in the regular season without Ja Morant, that they could do anything, that they could advance anywhere in the postseason without Ja Morant, is, I think, the ultimate sign that this guy is invaluable. Because if you don't believe your team, who's 18-2 without a guy in the regular season, can win a playoff game at all without that player in the postseason, then what are we really saying? And it's been appalling to me how so many people want to discredit what Ja Morant is doing. Just because he's not the leading candidate for league MVP doesn't mean he shouldn't be a top 5 MVP candidate, or that he's even an MVP candidate altogether, because he is. He absolutely is. But with that being said, he's missed too many games for one to justify that this particular season he should be the front runner for MVP. So overall, I thought that last night's performance by Giannis, did it catapult him over Nikola Jokic? No, I wouldn't say it catapulted him over him, but I definitely think it pulled him just about even, maybe 51% Jokic, 49% Giannis. I think it's been dwindled down to those two guys. If you're a fan of some old classical movies, I always make the reference to Alfalfa, and I would say that Jokic is leading Alfalfa by a hair, which is how Alfalfa won that final race. Little kind of hair sticking out by an inch. That's pretty much the margin that I give him over Giannis right now. But both of them proving to be absolutely invaluable to their teams. Okay. 2 minutes. I'm going to bring on my guest, Ben Cross, NBC Sports' Ben Cross. I did want to touch on one thing quickly from the NFL. They just came out yesterday, and the NFL owners approved of a new overtime rule that was proposed by the NFL, basically guaranteeing each team a possession in overtime. It would only apply in the postseason. None of these changes would apply in the regular season. Now, if each side in the postseason, because again, it guarantees each side at least one possession, if each side scores on their opening possession, scores a touchdown, but really even a field goal at that point, if they both score field goals, then it returns back to the traditional sudden death style. But it just guarantees that even if they score a touchdown, both sides have an opportunity to go down the field and score a touchdown. Now, since there's been a new playoff format has been implemented in 2010. There have been 12 overtime games in the NFL in the postseason. Now, 7 of those have resulted in the team in a team scoring a possession on their first or scoring a touchdown on their first possession and winning the game outright, which is just a hair above 50%, obviously, if you do the math. But 10 of the 12 teams that ended up winning those 12 games, 10 of those won the opening coin toss. So we had kind of, relegated the overtime period to a coin flip, in essence, if you were to look at the math. Now, obviously, the public outcry came several years ago in the 2018 AFC Championship game between the Patriots and the Kansas City Chiefs. Tom Brady wins it in overtime. Patrick Mahomes never got a chance to touch the football. It came back to the forefront in this postseason between the Bills and the Chiefs. Chiefs ended up winning. It was one of the most incredible games that I've ever seen. However, what we did see is the following weekend, the Bengals ended up defying those odds, becoming one of those two teams to have lost the coin flip and still managed to win. So it was possible to happen, but I do think that even I admitted after the game it was the right decision to, or I shouldn't say after the game, after this announcement was made, that I do think it was the right decision to alter the rule. I said that after that performance, that I don't think you are taking away anything from the game. There's no inherent disadvantage or advantage to allowing both sides to have one possession. It just simply makes it more fair. You give each opportunity to both teams in the postseason, at least in overtime. That's what I felt. So I'm happy that they made those changes, and I'm glad they could come to a resolution with regard to that. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to bring on to the show a good friend and a guest. NBC Sports' Ben Cross. Ben, good morning. How are you?
Good, Jonah. How you doing? It's been some time.
It's been some time. I appreciate you coming on. I would say that you're probably, and we're going to get into the Final Four in Carolina in just a moment. I would say that you're probably growing a March Madness postseason beard, but then again, you've always kind of had it.
I've remained relatively consistent. I certainly wouldn't grow it for the UNC Duke matchup. Not sure I'd have the time to do that, but it's been a fun postseason nonetheless. I just have stuck with the beard throughout. It's remained consistent.
Now, you've been a North Carolina fan your entire life, although I will say, really, you probably should be more of a Maryland or a Virginia fan, given your proximity to those schools as opposed to North Carolina. But needless to say, so you've obviously grown up where Duke is just the public enemy number one. Carolina's your favorite team. Are you surprised at all that after 257 meetings, this is the first time ever that these two teams are meeting in the NCAA tournament? Does that surprise you at all?
I think there's an element of it that does surprise me, and just how many tournaments these teams have been in. They're two of the biggest blue bloods in the sport. They tend to go farther than most other teams in the tournament, but there's an element of it that doesn't necessarily surprise me, and that is really just they put them on either sides of the bracket. They generally don't even meet or couldn't have even met until the championship game. This time they put them on the same Final Four slot. That's happened before, but they normally try and put them apart because they don't necessarily want that for the rivalry. Obviously, them meeting now, an immovable force meets an unmovable object. Eventually this was going to happen, but the fact that it's finally happening now in Coach K's final season is a little surreal. It is unbelievable, considering it hasn't happened until now. But at the same time, that's how the committee normally designs it. They normally don't want these teams to meet until the finals. They don't want an 8-1 matchup for the UNC Duke rivalry. That might tarnish it a tad. So it did ultimately end in what should be a tremendous matchup. The fact that it's happening now is quite a story.
And not to speak anything into existence, although it is interesting how serendipitous the matchup is, given that when Coach K won his first national championship in 1981, I believe, he faced off against North Carolina in the Final Four. That was the only other time that those two teams had met, I believe. It'd been, or no, not in the tournament. He had won They had mentioned something about how I think it was maybe when they last met potentially. I don't know.
They haven't met in the tournament before. This will
No,
be
not in the tournament. Maybe they met. Shoot, I don't
they,
remember. I can't remember.
one thing that a lot of people have looked at is the third time they play in a season normally is in the ACC tournament, or has always been in the ACC tournament. And if
Right.
they tend to meet in the ACC finals, one of those teams will ultimately go on to end up in a Final Four or a championship. It has seemed that has gone the way of things, throughout their rivalry history this year. Kind of
True.
matches that. Duke didn't win the ACC tournament final, but they did get there. But they didn't play
Fair.
USC, which tends to foreshadow a later matchup
Yes.
for a later matchup.
True. True. Well, so then let's stick with Carolina for a second because I know you'd have a lot to say about them and their season. Has this tournament run shocked you at all? And if it hasn't, when was the moment in the season? Maybe it was after the first round of the tournament where you kind of started to believe a little bit more in this team.
Them getting all the way to the Final Four shocked me. Them beating Baylor didn't necessarily shock me. Baylor had some injuries. They weren't necessarily playing their best basketball, and the Heels have been playing their best basketball. If you circle a point in the season where they turned it around, they had some tough losses, some close games right around Wake Forest. I'd like to say that was maybe mid to early February. And then you could start to see them winning some close games. Then they started to blow out some teams. And then obviously everyone's going to circle that game in Cameron Indoor against Duke, where they really stretched it out down the stretch and picked up a huge win that cemented them in the tournament. They were already in the tournament at that point, but a lot of people considered them on the bubble until they beat Duke. So they've been playing their best basketball. They played well in the ACC tournament until they went up against a red-hot Virginia Tech squad. So I didn't necessarily view their run to the Elite Eight as a shocker, but them actually getting to the Final Four has been unbelievable. I mean, beating St. Peter's wasn't necessarily a shock, but getting past UCLA was certainly a big game for them. I didn't necessarily believe they were going to win that game. I thought they were playing great basketball, but at the same time, UCLA is a solid squad. They weren't necessarily going through the same injury issues that Baylor had. They certainly had an injury to one of their better players, but the Heels being this consistent for this long in the tournament surprised me, but them playing well and getting to the second weekend wasn't necessarily a surprise.
Now, I know that you're probably going to initially disregard this question. It's going to seem like a very easy question to you. But because I have to imagine you have a lot of animosity, or maybe not animosity, but general kind of disdain towards Duke and Coach K and that program. I'm curious, would you, if you had to choose two scenarios, let's say hypothetically these were the two scenarios, is you beat Coach K, Cameron Indoor Stadium like you did, and you beat him in his final home game in the fashion that you did with all the alumni and all the hoopla, and you lose to Duke in the Final Four, or you lose to Coach K and Duke in that home finale at Cameron Indoor Stadium in his final season, but you beat Duke and you send Coach K into retirement in the Final Four with the uncertainty of what's going to happen in the championship game. Which memory would you rather be left with?
I think fans would be relatively split on that. I would ultimately take winning in the Final Four over that regular season finale. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think you can spin it as a Tar Heel fan either way that this goes down, or at least if it goes down where they lose. I think you could say, well, Coach K lost his last home game. That has to sting quite a bit. That was the last memory they have of him in that stadium, that historic stadium. I think just the Final Four, the fact that they haven't met yet, this is ultimate bragging rights for the rivalry. I would say you'd rather have this one. But I think considering where this team came from, they were supposed to be blown out in Cameron Indoor. And if you had said, oh, UNC and Duke will meet in the Final Four as well, people probably would have also said that they were going to get blown out in this matchup. So where the Heels are at this point, I think they're more or less playing with house money. If they lose this game, I think they can still look back and say, this wasn't one of our better teams, but we still beat Coach K at his home floor in his last game in Cameron Indoor, and we got all the way to the Final Four. Whereas Duke, if they lose this game, they're in quite a trench that it would be tough to dig out of because K is retiring after this year. So I think the Heels are playing with a little bit of house money. If you had to ask me between those two scenarios, though, I would take Heels winning the Final Four and losing the home closer for Coach K.
Well, that's why you are a pragmatist and you think logically. So I get it. I understand. But I was always curious because I did think that there was a certain deal, there was a certain amount of satisfaction that Carolina fans already got just by that game alone, where maybe they might not care as much about the Final Four.
It's a good question, and there's definitely a contingent that maybe are riding on easy street right now, viewing this game as, if we win it, it is all that much more sweeter. But if we don't, we still have that other memory.
And already, I think that Hubert Davis has done a great job kind of earning the hearts of the Carolina fans, because the job he's done this year is fantastic. So final question with the tournament, given the 4 teams that are remaining, who do you truthfully believe is the best team remaining in the draw?
I would say Duke is playing their best basketball, and if they are at their best, they are better than anyone else remaining. But I think it's going to be interesting with this Final Four because you have a number of solid teams. Everyone's going to be focusing on this UNC Duke game. Whoever wins that game is going to be going through this large emotional moment with beating a rival for the first time in the tournament, in the Final Four, to go to the championship game. To have a 2-day swing around where, Kansas or Villanova, they still have a big game, but whoever gets to that game probably won't have the same emotional toll or the emotional baggage from that game 2 days ago. And the mentality might be off. I mean, we remember Wisconsin and Duke back in 2015, the 2-day turnaround from that matchup, beating Kentucky, an undefeated team in the Final Four for Wisconsin, then having to go play a very solid Duke team. A lot of people consider that Wisconsin team to be better than that Duke team, but they just happened to have quite a turnaround. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what the final matchup is. Villanova losing one of their best players, now having to go up against Kansas. Kansas hasn't really had a tough road to get there. I think Kansas is probably the weakest of the bunch, but the fact that they're going up against a Villanova squad that's a little unhealthy with some injuries might give them not necessarily an edge, but bring that matchup to about a pick 'em. And then UNC Duke, I think Duke just has the most talent. So if they're shooting the best, they're playing the best, and they're more balanced than they had been in the regular season, then I think they have as good of a chance as anybody to win it. The Heels are an interesting team. I think right now they could very well be the most talented. They're shooting lights out. They're playing phenomenal defense. They're doing what they need to do. But I think there's still some question marks around their bottom end talent. They have a very tight lineup. They play their starters quite a bit, and they don't have a ton coming off the bench. You saw what happened against Baylor when some of their players started to get kicked out for, flagrant 2 fouls, fouling out, injuries. Suddenly their lineup wasn't all that talented and their ceiling wasn't all that great. So I think Duke probably has the highest ceiling of any team. I think UNC's playing better than anyone else right now. All those factors, it should be a really, really good Final Four.
The other interesting thing about Duke that's been different about them this year as opposed to years past is they've been one of the best execution teams in like the final 5 minutes of these games. The regular season, they're still trying to find out who they were, and in the postseason, though, the final 5 minutes, their stars have been playing well, but they've been really executing well, which has been the difference. But again, I think Carolina, they've got a lot of upside. If Caleb Love, listen, obviously Wisconsin's my top team, but I love UCLA. They're a close second. If Caleb Love doesn't drop 30 points in that game, I think UCLA is in this position right here. But because he was shooting lights out, it is what it is.
Yeah, he can hit a shot from anywhere. I mean, if UNC is going to reach its ceiling, it is going to be partially or in large part because of Caleb Love hitting shots like that. He can sling it and has the green light to sling it from anywhere.
So let's transition to the NFL. There's been a lot of trades going on in the NFL. Now I want to put a pin on the Deshaun Watson trade for a second and just look at some of the other trades. Russell Wilson obviously being moved from Seattle to Denver. You have Khalil Mack, you have Tyreek Hill, you have Devontae Adams. Obviously also Deshaun Watson's been traded. But of all these major trades, which one surprised you the most?
I was a little surprised with what Washington was doing. I didn't see them going after Carson Wentz. I figured, they have Taylor Heineke, and this is, obviously not one of the bigger trades in that it doesn't really impact either team all that much. I think it freed up the Colts to go after Matt Ryan, which I actually think was one of the better trades I've seen. But I think for Washington, the Commanders now, they kind of they didn't give up a ton for Carson Wentz, but they're basically saying we believe Carson Wentz is better than Heineke, and maybe we're not going after quarterback the following year. Maybe we're settling in with Wentz, and I think Wentz showed what his top end was in Indianapolis, and it's not that great. And I think it takes a team that already was underperforming and maybe sits them at a similar bar or a lower bar with a little bit of future commitment. So I don't necessarily love the move by them. I think you can look at some of these other big moves. I wasn't necessarily shocked, but at the same time, didn't necessarily love the trade for Denver with Russell Wilson. I don't think either team necessarily became all that much better. The Broncos have a chance, but Russell hasn't necessarily been playing his best. And I thought the Broncos gave up a decent amount to get him. That should be interesting. I think they're still going to need a balanced run game. They have a couple other positions that I think they need to fill. But if they are able to fill them, maybe the Broncos can be the better team. I think Indianapolis said that they did a great job with Matt Ryan. I think he is the perfect fit for them right now. He's not necessarily a long-term quarterback, but I think he gives them everything they need in the short term, and they have a lot of players that they have on short-term contracts. They need to win now, and I thought Matt Ryan was a perfect piece for them. So I think there isn't one that necessarily stands out as bigger than the rest, but I think there were some interesting moves. I think Washington made a poor move. I thought Indy made a great move. I thought the Broncos in Seattle, maybe about even, but didn't necessarily improve either of their stocks in my mind all that much.
I actually agree with the Indianapolis Colts take. I really like Matt Ryan being just a steady, consistent performer for the Colts. I've been ever since Jonathan Taylor's been a part of the Colts, I've really wanted to see them excel, and they've had the rosters to do it. It's just been the quarterback play that's left a lot to be desired. And there were moments last year where, it seemed like maybe Carson Wentz had those flashes where he played well. I think at San Francisco was a good example in the rain where he was playing well, but the problem was you can't beat Jacksonville on the road to clinch a playoff spot. And then in the playoffs, who knows what happens. But
right.
I think that was ultimately that kind of signed his death certificate to be sent somewhere else, because at that point it's like, okay, we just can't win with this guy. I wanted to put a specific pin on the Deshaun Watson trade. Now I want to bring it back and remove that pin. So he obviously was traded to the Cleveland Browns. They gave a haul back to the Texans, $230 million fully guaranteed. Obviously, we know all the pending 22 lawsuits that have been filed against him. He hasn't been indicted on criminal charges. And then he just had his introductory press conference last week. And I have to be honest with you, Ben, to me, watching the press conference, it felt like an interrogation. It seemed pretty combative and just felt awkward from start to finish, almost like Andrew Berry was on the defensive the entire time. It's like he was going into a hornet's nest. He knew exactly that this was going to draw a lot of pushback. Let me ask you, what were your thoughts on just the Cleveland Browns deciding to absorb all that backlash and trade for Watson? And then what did you make of his press conference last week?
I thought it was an interesting move by the Browns. I think Baker, while he necessarily hasn't shown that he can be a consistent top 10 threat, I didn't necessarily feel like they were one of the teams that were going to make one of those huge pushes. I think if Watson can get through this controversy and they can settle him in, it could be a great move for them. But at the same time, I didn't necessarily see them as a team, and I don't want to use the word desperate enough to go after Deshaun, but I think you do have to try and overlook a lot of these things if you're going to bring him in. As far as that press conference goes, I think it was more or less what we expect. There's a lot of things piling up for Deshaun Watson right now, and I think it was understandable that it was going to be a defensive atmosphere, and I thought you hit the nail on the head. I thought him and his lawyer were basically backtracking the entire time, trying to play defense. And I saw it again. You saw some of his leaked deposition and some of these civil and criminal cases. I think it is not necessarily going his way right now. I think he is headed toward a suspension. I don't know how hefty that will be. I think a lot will ultimately ride on how many civil cases go his way or don't. But even if they all go his way, I still see the NFL handing down a rather hefty fine and suspension. So it should be interesting to see how long he's going to sit out, what the Browns are able to do with him out. But as far as where he sits with that press conference and within the grand scheme of the NFL, it's definitely not good. And I don't see it getting any better. I don't see him necessarily showing all that much remorse. It doesn't seem like he's coming out ahead of a lot of these things. It seems like he's playing catch up more often than not.
And okay, finally, when you look at the AFC West, since we've mentioned Russell Wilson, you're not sure necessarily how he's going to mesh with that group. If you had to bet your life savings on which team is going to win that division, what does your gut say at this very moment in time?
I would do absolutely everything in my power to avoid betting my life savings on an AFC West winner right now. I would like to say the Chargers. I just feel like of all the teams in that division, they stayed the most consistent in this offseason. I think they bolstered some of their pass rush issues. I think Herbert is still there and developing. I think their run game is still as solid as ever. Their receiving core is still intact. I think they're just the most consistent team from last season, and I think that's going to pay dividends when you look of all the chaos that happened in the rest of that division. I think it's going to be really interesting to see. I think the Raiders are in a good spot. Bringing in Devontae is a great move for them. Derek Carr, he's been a lot better than I think people have wanted to perceive, and so I think they have a great chance. But I just think the Chargers have the highest ceiling, and I think given their consistency from last year and everything that's happened with the Chiefs, I think they just have the best chance right now. I wouldn't necessarily feel confident about betting my life savings on them, but I just have a feeling that they're going to be the team that maybe squeaks out a 1 or 1.5 win over the division at the end of the year.
It's interesting. It's funny because a lot of people have been surprisingly hitching their wagon to Russell Wilson and the Broncos already. It seems like that's the team with the most uncertainty, yet a lot of people favor them to win the division. Finally, Ben, quick 10 seconds, and then I'm going to let you go. Are you disappointed that you haven't seen really any major moves from your Cowboys this offseason, or is that something that you expected?
It's something I expected. I think when you looked at who they needed to re-sign, who they needed to deal, they ultimately had to kind of just let a little of it go. I didn't love seeing Amari leave, but they needed to clear some space in order to sign Gallup. Gallup was an interesting signing. Cedric Wilson's an interesting signing. They have some injuries on the offense, but ultimately weapons haven't really been their issue, and I think they'll be fine on that point. I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do in the draft. They don't have a ton of top picks. Ultimately, I think it was just set up to be a disappointing offseason, and that's ultimately what they've delivered. They haven't done anything spectacular, but I don't think anyone really expected them to. I think I'd love to see them bolster the offensive line in the draft and post the draft, but beyond that, I think they were going to have a little bit of a regression regardless of what they did, unless they decided to clear house and just murder their cap space. But I think ultimately it was kind of off season. Nothing spectacular, but nothing different from what I expected.
Well, obviously, best of luck watching Carolina on Saturday. Good luck to your team. If they win, maybe I'll bring you back. If they don't, who knows? We'll see. I don't know if you'll be in the right emotional space.
We'll see how available I am if that happens.
But, yeah. And then of course, Wisconsin. I just two for 23 in the second round to Iowa State. I think what hurt me more is the fact that it was played in Milwaukee. It was a quasi home game, and yet that also stung. Like if they played them, I don't know, in Waco, Texas, or something. Okay, I'd be disappointed. I can live with that. It was in Milwaukee, an hour and a half. Yeah. All right. Ben Cross, NBC Sports is Ben Cross. As always, thank you so much for coming on, man. It's great to see you. And again, best of luck rooting for Carolina this weekend.
Thank you. Always great to be on. Thanks, Jonah.
All right. is NBC Sports' Ben Cross. Always great to have him on. Final topic of the day, my Malkin's moments. I have a couple great Malkin's moments for you. Took place just a couple days ago. So sticking with the NBA, Luka Doncic and the Dallas Mavericks. Luka Doncic had a monster game, a 30-point triple-double in the first 3 quarters of the game in the Dallas Mavericks' 128-110 win over the Lakers. Now, granted, I understand LeBron, AD, they weren't playing, but it doesn't negate the fact that he was productive through the first 3 quarters. 34 points, 12 rebounds, 12 assists for Luka Doncic. The Mavericks are currently 4th in the Western Conference. On the season, Doncic is averaging 28 points, 9 rebounds, 8.5 assists on the year, just doing Luka Doncic stuff. He deserves to make my Malkin's moments. Another player in the NBA, Paul George, made his return after a 3-month absence due to a elbow surgery. He was repairing or rehabbing a torn ulnar collateral ligament in his right elbow, underwent surgery on December 22nd. He's been gone since December 22nd, and yet he comes back, drops in 34 points on 10 for 20 shooting in the win over the Utah Jazz last night. It capped a 25-point comeback against the Jazz. Now, obviously, we all remember how the last time these two teams faced off in the postseason at Crypto.com Arena, at the time it was Staples Center, how the Clippers rallied from down 22 points at the half in Game 6. They actually ended up trailing by 25 after Donovan Mitchell hit a 3 to start the third quarter. And from that point on, they went on to win the second half 81-44 in that postseason game in Game 6 to pull away and win by 12, like 131-119. So that was the lasting image and memory that I had when he came back. He was 6 for 9 from 3, was Paul George with 4 steals. And apparently his 34 points were the most ever by a player who had missed their team's previous 40-plus games within one season, according to Elias Sports Bureau research. And Paul George now has more 30-point games this season. He's got 7, despite missing the last 40 games in 3 months. He's got 7 30-point games this season. He's got more than the rest of the Clippers team combined. The Clippers team has 6 players that have, or at least 6 performances with a 30-point game. He already has 7 on the year, despite missing the last 3 months. So big shout out to him and the Clippers, the job Ty Lue's been doing with them this year. I know Ty Lue's not going to garner much consideration for Coach of the Year, but I think the way he's been able to guide the Clippers this year shows his coaching prowess. He's been working with really, no stars at all for the majority of the season, and he still has them in the position that they are, firmly entrenched in the 8th spot. So shout out to him and Paul George. And finally, shout out to the UConn Huskies, the women's basketball program. What a game that was against number 1 seed NC State a couple days ago in the Elite 8. The 2 seed UConn and the Huskies advancing to their 14th consecutive Final Four under Gino Auriemma. It's his 22nd overall Final Four appearance. Huskies ended up winning in double overtime, 91-87. It's the first time in women's NCAA tournament history that there's been a double overtime game in the Elite 8 or farther in the history of the sport, which is unbelievable. It speaks to just how fantastic of a game it was. And let me give a big shout out not only to that program, but also Paige Beckers. 27 points, 10 for 15 shooting from the floor. She's been garnering all kinds of praise, as she should be, and drawing comparisons to Diana Taurasi. Sue Bird complimented her, paying her that ultimate compliment, drawing the comparison to Diana Taurasi. And Beckers has been fantastic, the reigning National Player of the Year as a freshman. Now she's a sophomore. She missed substantial time due to an injury, just kind of is still working her way back into peak performance. And they needed her in that game because NC State, the Wolfpack, they're a really well-coached team that's been a really good team all year. They ended up going like 30. They had 30-plus wins, 32-4, I believe, was their record. The other UConn freshman, a Z Food or Z Fudd, apologies if I mispronounced the last name, poured in 19 points. But here's the thing: the game had 13 ties and 9 lead changes. Or pardon, flip it: 13 lead changes, 9 ties. So there's all kinds of history at stake for both of these sides. The Wolfpack were trying to advance to their first ever Final Four since 1998. Obviously, the Huskies advancing to their 14th consecutive. And again, credit Gino Auriemma. Obviously, more credit goes to the players, but especially to the coaching staff to be able to constantly, year in and year out, produce the ultimate winners. We always think that sports should be expected at the college level when you're able to get all the top recruits, but the reality is to actually execute it in that big tournament and to have players, to recruit the types of players that have the mental makeup and the mental fortitude to be able to deliver in the clutch like that. It's impressive. But again, yeah, shout out to Paige Beckers, shout out to the entire UConn Huskies women's team, and really also NC State for delivering an all-time great game, let alone basketball game, let alone men's, women's, doesn't matter. Double overtime. You had clutch baskets, clutch performances from both sides. It was absolutely fantastic to watch. Wanted to give them a major shout out on Morning Joe. So that'll do it for us. Thank you so much for joining me right here on Morning Joe every single Monday and Wednesday morning, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 to 11 Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. Make sure to subscribe to my YouTube page, Morning Joe, J-O, with Jonah Malkin on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter at Jonah_Malkin or at morning_Joe_. Follow me on Instagram, jmalk97, or on TikTok at Jonah Malkin. Thank you so much. And as always, have a lovely rest of your morning.